And just a note about our webinar today. This is co-hosted by the National Center on Intensive Intervention and also the Division for Research from the Council for Exceptional Children, where Sarah Powell, one of our presenters, is the Committee Chair for Knowledge Utilization, and where all three of the panelists today are members. Next slide. So in today's webinar, we'll be covering a few kind of high-level topics. First, starting with what is explicit instruction. You've heard probably a number of definitions of this, may have kind of a general idea or some idea of some of the components, but we will go in more depth about kind of how we define it based on the research literature and the work that we've done. And then also we will talk some about research that provides the basis for explicit instruction and why we believe it is an important instructional tool for students with disabilities in particular, but also students generally and students who may require intervention. Then we'll talk a bit more about some of the essential practices that comprise explicit instruction and take a deeper dive into those. We'll also spend some time providing a preview of a free online course that is available on the NCII website that was developed with our partners at the University of Connecticut. And then for which there will be some subsequent courses also coming soon that we'll tell you a little bit about. And then finally, we'll provide some examples of modeling and practice. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Sarah Powell, who's from the University of Texas at Austin.
All right, thank you so much, Rebecca. So I'm just going to talk for just a few minutes about what is explicit instruction, and then I will turn it over to Devin Kearns, who's going to get into the nitty-gritty of explicit instruction. So when we think about explicit instruction, there are several different terms that people use to think about explicit instruction. So you might be familiar with some of the terms that are on this slide, but for example, we might hear about systematic instruction, direct instruction. Sometimes people refer to this as assisted instruction. But we at the National Center on Intensive Intervention are going to use the term explicit instruction. But when we're thinking about explicit instruction, we would like you to realize that we're talking about all of these approaches to instruction in which we are systematic in the approach that we provide for the students' instruction. We are very direct, and we are assisting students with their learning. Now, when we think about definitions for explicit instruction, there are several different definitions that are out there. And in fact, it's really hard to find a consistent definition. And on the next slide, we'll look at some of the definitions that we have pulled from some pretty recent research related to explicit instruction. So for example, Gersten and his colleagues, they say that explicit instruction involves step-by-step plan that then is implemented for a specific set of problems, for example, a single skill. And then students practice using these same steps that have been modeled by the teacher to solve different types of problems. Charlie Hughes and his colleagues, they will talk about explicit instruction as making sure you're segmenting complex skills. So this is really like focusing on one or two skills that a student needs to learn. And then after you figure out what you are going to teach, teachers use modeling or think alouds to show students how to work through problems. And then as they do that, they systematically fade different supports that have been put in place and then provide practice opportunities for students and then providing feedback to students as that goes along. And then Anita Archer and Charlie Hughes in their seminal book called Explicit Instruction, their definition of this is that it's a direct approach to teaching that thinks about both instructional design and the delivery of that instruction. So in putting together the module that Devin Kearns is going to talk about for the majority of this webinar, Devin came up with a definition of explicit instruction, which we can see here on the next slide. And with Devin's definition of explicit instruction, I will just read this so we all make sure we're on the same page, but it's a way of teaching where the teacher is going to select an important objective and then figures out a learning outcome for that objective. And then the teacher designs structured instructional experiences explaining directly to the student. And then during this, the teacher models the skills that are taught and provides scaffolded practice to help a student achieve mastery in an academic area. So when we think about explicit instruction, we focus on this because there's a strong research base that supports explicit instruction. So on the next few slides, I'll just highlight some of the research that says that we should be using explicit instruction for students that have learning difficulties or learning disabilities. So for example, on the next slide, these are just some screenshots from recent meta-analyses or syntheses that have been conducted in the area of reading. And both of these studies, as well as numerous others, we will see that when they're looking at the collection of research that supports reading outcomes for students with learning difficulties, the biggest thread that we see sewn throughout those different interventions is that the instruction is explicit for those students. So that means teachers are modeling different ways to do different types of things in reading, and students are engaged in authentic practice opportunities. Not only do we see this in reading, but we also see this in writing. So on the next slide here are just a few of some of the recent meta-analyses and syntheses related to both handwriting and writing. And one of the things, if you read these articles and read some of the others in this area, they will talk about the use of explicit instruction. And that's true even if they are doing something like self-regulated strategy development, which is a very common strategy in writing. Teachers explicitly model how to use those strategies and give students good practice opportunities to practice their writing. Not only do we see this in writing, but we also see this in the area of mathematics. So here are a few syntheses that have been done at the elementary and secondary levels that have come out in the past few years. And across these syntheses, they identified explicit instruction as one of the primary components of effective mathematics intervention. And not only do we see this in reading, writing, and mathematics, but there was also a recent synthesis that came out in science talking about the necessity of explicit vocabulary instruction for students in science. And you'll see that on the next slide there. So basically, across the research base, we see explicit instruction mentioned again and again. And it's for that reason that Devin Kearns and colleagues, in conjunction with the National Center on Intensive Intervention, developed a module focused exclusively on explicit instruction. And so I'm going to turn it over to Devin so he can tell you all about what explicit instruction is and how explicit instruction should be used. So Devin, I'll turn it over to you.
Sarah, thank you so much. And Nick is going to get, I'm going to get the, let's see, I'm going to show my screen here. All right, so, okay. So we're now looking at my screen, and I'm going to walk you all through a guide to explicit instruction, sort of to dive into it, as you see there. And so just so you know, I'm an assistant professor of special education at the University of Connecticut, and I'm also on Twitter, as you can see there below. So the purpose of this today is to focus first on why explicit instruction is important. Sarah's already talked about what explicit instruction looks like, and I'm going to go more into why that is really important. So here we go into that piece. So when we focus on explicit instruction, as Sarah already said, it's a way of teaching. The teacher will select an important objective, and they're going to make sure to specify the learning outcome. They're then going to design instructional experiences that first include modeling by explaining directly, and then using planned examples to model the skill being taught. And then involves practice, both guided and independent. And finally, it involves a set of supporting practices that support the explicit instruction practice that help students engage best in modeling and practice. And we're going to focus today on the modeling and practice components of this. Sarah's already talked a lot about the research on this, and you can see here some additional data from a variety of syntheses and direct articles that suggest that explicit instruction is very effective. So what I want to do is talk about why explicit instruction is so important for students who have intensive intervention needs. And the big point here is that when students are learning something new, there's a very high demand on their working memory. And the demand on their working memory makes it very challenging for them to be able to take in all of the new information. And I'm going to use what I think is sort of maybe an unusual analogy here to sort of illustrate the point. And so it's about stones in a bowl. So here's the bowl, there are the stones, and let me explain to you what I mean here. So what I want to do, though, I want to talk about sort of the bowl being, it could either be sort of these sort of cookie cutter, same size bowls. Think about that as maybe representing students with typical achievement. And then this bowl, which let's say has the same volume, is really a vase rather than a bowl. But in this case, it's shaped differently. And so the way into it is quite different, as you can see there. But we can say the volume is the same, which basically means students with intensive intervention needs are absolutely capable of learning the same things as their peers who have typical achievement, but it might be in a somewhat different way. And that's where explicit instruction comes in. So we think about the way we're going to teach students who need intensive intervention. We can focus on them as having this sort of narrow neck to the bowl, and whereas students with typical achievement sort of have this larger neck. And we can put here in the middle, you can see there the little pebble. That's going to kind of represent a unit of knowledge. And what you see for students who need intensive intervention is that the bottleneck sort of represents cognitive load, where students who need intensive intervention often have such an intensive cognitive load when they're learning something new that they're not capable of getting the information. And so the question then becomes, how do we help both of these students? In the case of students with typical achievement, we take some examples of some of these items of knowledge. The instructional approach often is to sort of toss them toward the bowl. In other words, to design an instructional experience where students get to kind of experience things in their own way. They get to sort of think about it in lots of ways. They have lots of ways into the content. And if you do it that way for those students, it ends up that they have lots of, stones in the bowl, as I said. When you look at students who need intensive intervention, if you use that same approach where you sort of give them a variety of experiences that aren't as structured, you end up with, as you see here, stones strewn around the bowl, but not actually inside. And so there's one more stone. There's another stone. And so what we want to do instead is we're going to use an approach. We're going to very carefully put a stone in the bowl one at a time. That means we're going to use explicit instruction to make very clear how all of the things that students are learning fit together. We're going to use the modeling and practice framework. We're going to use those supporting practices in order for students to be successful. And the ultimate result should be lots of, stones in the bowl. And there's a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay where she talks about building a cairn of knowledge. And so I think of these stones building a cairn of knowledge, this sort of pyramid of understanding that we can get students to achieve through explicit instruction. There ends my strange analogy. So as Rebecca and Sarah already mentioned, we have a course on this that was designed by me with my colleagues here at UConn and with the assistance of Nathan Jones at Boston University, and of course support of Rebecca and Teri Marx and their colleagues at the American Institutes for Research. So I'm going to talk briefly about what the course is and how it fits into NCII. This course is designed to be a set of modules that will help you understand explicit instruction. It's going to give you all of the components I already mentioned in that graphic that you saw. And we did this because, as you know, many students who need intensive intervention need a lot of support with explicit instruction, and there really aren't a lot of courses available to help you understand these things. If you happen to be a university faculty member, often we don't have resources to think about how to include explicit instruction when we talk about intensive intervention. And there's not a lot of information that fits into the database individualization framework that you learn through the National Center. Because it's a really critical practice, we want to make sure that students have it. So let me explain a little bit more how explicit instruction fits into the National Center model of database individualization. For those who aren't familiar, database individualization is a way of providing students with a standardized Tier 2 standard protocol intervention, and then using progress monitoring, assessment, and adaptations to improve students' outcomes. And we can think about explicit instruction in these terms. So we're going to talk about, first, we have a program that we're implementing with Fidelity. And then in this example, the student doesn't show adequate response. We then look at the student data and we notice that the student shows some progress, but not as much progress as we would like. And the teacher tries something simple, perhaps adding a few minutes of instruction, maybe an additional half hour per week of instruction, with the thought that if they're already showing some progress, maybe a little bit of additional practice will help. And then we find in this case is that basically the dosage, the amount of time, is the intervention that was used. And this is from the Taxonomy of Adaptations, which was originally shown by Fuchs, and Malone in a 2017 article. And these are all different ways to think about intensifying instruction, ways to make adaptations. In this case, the selected adaptation was dosage. What we find in this case is that the progress was not sufficient. The student didn't do as well as we hoped. And what we do in that case is we go back to the diagnostic component and we analyze what might be the cause. And so we look here, and when we look at the student work samples in this example, the student seems confused. It's not that the student doesn't understand anything. There's just a pattern of sort of scattered understanding. And we look at that, we might think, perhaps we need to change the instruction the student is experiencing. So it might not be in the end that it's the student who is having the difficulty on their own because they don't have enough time, for example. It's because the method we've used to help them understand it is not adequate. And so as a result, we use these explicit instruction principles to improve students' outcomes. And we can do this in two ways. We can do it when we have a program or not. So in the DBI model, we want you to have a secondary prevention program that you're going to start with, because programs for secondary prevention have a very good track record of improving student response. When you have a program, what sometimes you find is that the program doesn't do as good a job of setting up the students for success with explicit instruction. It may have some great content, but the skills might be jumbled together. It might not be clear what the expectations are. The lessons might be focused on activities rather than clear objectives. And sometimes secondary prevention programs provide the good content without explaining at all how they want you to teach. And that, in that case, explicit instruction principles should be embedded even within an already established program. In many cases, there aren't programs available. There are more and more programs being developed for lots of cases, but particularly in high school and in some areas of, for example, mathematics, there aren't as many programs available. So if you don't have a program, you need to decide what to teach in an explicit way. And then you need to decide how you're actually going to teach it using explicit instruction. That's a tremendous amount of work, but it's something that you have to do in order to provide students with support if you know that they need explicit instruction. So turning again then to the course, I want to walk you through a few of the features of the course. And the features are listed here. We have videos to learn the content, materials available to show you how the video related to the videos. We have examples from real curricula built into the course. We have examples from real classrooms and activities to help you cognitively process the information. And for those of you who might have a coaching role, there's also information for you about how to support your student teachers or professional learning community with this, with the explicit instruction course. If you happen to be on the internet and you want to take a look at the course, you can see you can see what I'm talking about here. This is from Module 5, which is the first module of the ones on explicit instruction. We started with Module 5 because the first 4 modules provide an overview of data-based individualization. That's explained on the overview page for the module. And the first thing you see if you look at Module 5 is you have a set of videos, and you can see them here. That's a video of me. Full disclosure about this course is that you will see a lot of videos. So if none of you can actually see me. That is what I look like right there on the screen. And so you'll see a lot of videos of me. You see me actually talking about the stones in the bowl. So you could watch that again, but there's a lot of detail built into those videos to help you understand how all of this works. Along with the videos, we have 2 additional supports for you. One is that it says here on this slide toward the bottom, complete slide deck, by which we mean all the slides that I present on the screen are available for you to use. You can use them as part of a professional learning community. If you're a teacher, you can use them as a faculty member. These are available to you to use for free as much as you want in order to make people understand better explicit instruction. There also, you see there a workbook. The workbook aligns directly with all of the videos, and what the workbook allows you to do is to follow along with the videos as you learn, so it helps you maximize your cognitive processing of the content. If I want to recommend to you that if you decide you would like to begin doing some of the course, the best thing to do to help you understand it is to watch the videos in order and use the workbook to help you through it. And we actually recommend that you print the workbook or you make a PDF of the workbook, and it is a PDF, and you can make something you can write on, so you can actually do the activities which involve things like guided notes to help you process the content. In terms of examples from real curricula, here's an example of me talking about a curriculum in which it was described to students how to do a particular kind of mathematics, and then we gave examples of how the students might process that information within a lesson, and we talked about that. We anonymized them because we didn't want publishers and developers to feel like we were sort of picking on anybody. So, but they are examples from real curriculum. We also built in real classroom examples that involve not just great examples, but cases where there was a mixed by mixed, what I mean is that it wasn't all great practices. Sometimes there were practices that weren't ideal. This is an example of one of the videos of a high school teacher working with students who need intensive intervention. And some of this video shows very good practice and some of it does not. In addition to the videos, there are, along with that, examples of me talking more about these. And so you would watch the video. You watch the video within the module, so you actually watch me watching the video. You watch the video with me. And then what I do is I actually sort of telestrate this, much in the way that you sometimes see people do, like the weather people might write on the screen or something, or they do with elections and football sometimes. And so I actually illustrate or telestrate how the examples work so that you can help you process the content better. Oops, so there's the examples. We discussed those within the modules. There are a variety of activities for all of the modules. So this is an example of the kind of things that are included. So for example, you have the videos, you have the workbook, you have an article for this module that we strongly recommend you read. It's by Martin, 2016, and he talks about load reduction instruction that helps students with the working memory challenges they often have. It's a great article, and we talk about it in the module, but you also might want to read it on your own. We have teacher demonstrations I'll show you shortly. We have those examples from real curricula. We also design quizzes for those who are teaching other teachers or teaching in a university setting. We have discussion board posts you can use. We have journal entries that align with classroom applications. So if you're intending to do this in a classroom, we have an opportunity for you to think about how to match those things up. Okay, so that's an example of all of the activities there. For those of you who are working in an environment where you might be a coach, so you might be instructional coach at a school, you might be instructional lead on a professional learning community, you might be a faculty member at a university who provides support to teachers, you might be a student teaching supervisor. In any of these cases, we have a set of coaching materials that are designed to be interactive and non-evaluative, based on checklists of content rather than on some sort of subjective term like, I like that lesson. And they're directly targeted to support the module content. And they combine both virtual and in-person activities that you can do. So if you're a coach who's far away from your teachers, not everything has to be in person. It's designed to be done in a variety of ways. And that part of this work was designed with the support of the Bristol-Warren Regional School District in Rhode Island. The Director of Pupil Personnel Services, Leslie Anderson, was instrumental in not only coming up with some of the ideas for these modules, but also supporting us in testing them out. So we've actually tested both the in-person and visual components of the coaching, so we know that this can be effective to support students. And basically, we have this as collaborative work to further develop the work that we're doing. So I want to move now into describing the modeling and practice framework that we have and giving you some examples of some of the things you experience if you decide to do the course. This is a little bit of a preview. I'll start by reviewing the components of our model. So it all begins with a clear objective. We talk about having an important focus, for example, on standards and on student IEP objectives. And then providing a specific learning outcome. So when you know what it is you want to teach, making sure you provide a very clear objective that has a behavioral objective linked to it, or behavioral learning outcome linked to it, so it's clear what students will do at the end of the lesson. Once you come up with an objective, you have your modeling. That will involve coming up with a very clear explanation of the concepts you're going to be covering, and then providing students with planned examples of how the clear explanation is done in practice. And then we come up with practices, and we have students either do guided practice or independent practice. And we can do either of those, or we can do both of those. And you'll know this, those of you familiar, this fits into an I do, we do, you do framework. We've termed it just modeling and practice because we know that sometimes we need both guided and independent practice, but sometimes we only need one. And we didn't want folks to feel like you always have to do both in order for it to be successful. It's just an entire practice framework. And finally, we have supporting practices. Supporting practices are a set of things that you would do across modeling and practice. That's why it's there underneath both of these that are going to help students process the content. We have ways to help get students to respond frequently. We have ways, we talk about ways to provide immediate feedback, and we talk about ways to keep the lesson moving so that students will be able to maintain their processing of the content. So now I'll turn to actually one of the components of this, which is modeling. For every part of this, as I mentioned, we have a checklist that goes with it. So the checklist specifies sort of the kinds of behaviors we want to see when you, for example, here give a clear explanation, model those planned examples, and then use the supporting practices underneath them. These are the things we expect you to do for modeling. I'm going to give you one example of this, which is with an clear explanation. And the criteria we have for a clear explanation are that it has to be accurate, meaning that it has to specify all the critical elements of what's being learned, and it doesn't include anything incorrect. It also has to be complete. It needs to include everything that's necessary for the skill. It needs to match what the learning outcome is. Whatever you decided, students will do at the end. What you're explaining needs to match that exactly. And finally, you don't leave students to figure things out for themselves. So on the left side of the screen, you have an example here. This is from a resource provided by NCII. You may know that NCII provides examples of activities you can do for language arts and mathematics to support students' understanding of those things. And here you can see an example of a math lesson. So I'm going to read this to you so we can all read along. So first we have, so it says objectives. Student will add 3-digit numbers with or without regrouping using the standard algorithm. And that is the one that many people are familiar with. There are other algorithms, but this is a standard example. So first you add the ones. If the answer is more than 9, regroup, write the ones answer. Add the tens. If the answer is more than 9, regroup, write the tens answer. And then add the hundreds. If the answer is more than 9, regroup, write the hundreds answer. So now we can look at that in terms of our criteria. First, is that accurate? Well, I'm not an expert on mathematics, but my colleagues in mathematics, including Dr. Powell, assure me that this is not incorrect. And there's nothing about this that is wrong. I got this from the NCII website, so I think it should be accurate. Sarah, is that correct? She's muted, but maybe she can tell us.
That is correct, Devin.
That is, thank you. Okay, good. I'm glad I got that right. And then the second thing, is it complete? Does it include everything students need to do? And absolutely in this case, all the steps in regrouping for 3-digit numbers are included. It matches perfectly. And students aren't expected to figure things out for themselves, right? So with the complete explanation, you have to include all the critical elements, match the learning outcome, and not have students intuit anything. In this case, though, you would have to be sure that students already understood place value and basic regrouping with 2-digit numbers, for example. So this would be a continuation of that. So I want to turn then to an example of this. So I want to show you 2 short videos, and these are our lead teacher demonstrations. So we have a teacher who's going to create an imaginary lesson where there are no students, and we're going to see whether or not she then does modeling. So I've moved here not from the practice onto modeling, because I want to give us just a short example of each of these. So with modeling, our criteria in the purple box say that it needs to show, the model needs to show all the steps and provide unique examples. If you show all the steps, if it's a procedure, you provide a unique example. If it's knowledge like vocabulary or content you're learning. You always verbalize your thinking, you say out loud what you're thinking, and then you have students observe but not do the work. So we're going to look at Ms. Leonard's example. This is Caitlin Leonard. She's a doctoral student here at UConn, and she will be graduating soon, and we've been very lucky to have her. So we're going to take that example. We're going to look at 2 videos now to see if she does a good job with modeling according to the criteria you see right there. So let's watch the first video.
We just learned that the sound spelling A consonant E makes the long A sound, just like we hear in cake. Now we're going to practice reading words with the sound spelling A consonant E. Step 1, we're going to identify the pattern. And step 2, we're going to read the word. I'll show you how to read the first 3 words. Identify the pattern, A. Read the word, cake. A, tape. A, save. Now it's your turn to practice reading the words.
Okay, so that's our first example. Let's look at a second one to see again if Ms. Leonard meets all the criteria for modeling. So watch this example.
We just learned that the magic E can make the A say the long sound, just like we hear in cake. Let's practice reading some words. Who can read the first word for me?
Okay, so now let's take a look at those examples and let's contrast whether or not she met our criteria for modeling. You can see them at the bottom. So in the first example, did she show all the steps? Yes, there were 2 steps and she showed both. Did she verbalize her thinking? Yes, she did. She did that out loud for the first example. She did not continue to do that, but she didn't feel the students needed it, and the imaginary students needed it. And then she had students observe. She did not make the students do any of the work. So that would be an example of good modeling. In example 2, she provided an explanation, but she didn't provide a procedure for how to do it. And so as a result, students aren't going to be confident they know how to do this. She also did not say anything about her thinking, and then she had the students immediately do the work. And I would say that one of the things I see most often as a problem is that people will have students do things before they're ready. They'll immediately move from a very brief explanation like we saw here without verbalizing, and immediately have students practice in that way where they ask students one at a time what they think about things. And that's not what we want to see. So moving on to practice, this is a long list of things that constitute practice that I'm not going to go through in detail. I'm going to read just the 5 big boxes there. First, you need to decide what type of practice you need. Do you need guided or independent or both? Then you want to make sure that you provide practice that's directly aligned with your learning outcome, and you want to make sure that students will be successful with it. In guided practice, we often recommend 85% accuracy. In independent practice, 90 to 95% accuracy. Then we're either going to provide guided or independent practice. And then at the end, we make strategic decisions about what to do next. For example, will we move on to the next skill, or will we expand students' thinking by perhaps using a different type of instruction, not explicit instruction, to expand students' understanding? And that strategic decision is up to the teacher. So let's look at the guided practice component of this for a moment. So here you can see the learning outcome for this lesson we're going to watch is that the students will correctly segment spoken words orally and identify each sound with a token. And the teacher is going to provide guided practice, and we're going to see if she follows these steps, whether she leads students in the steps toward the learning outcome. Does she do the steps one at a time? Then does she provide appropriate prompts? Does she prompt students for what to do before they're required to do a step? And then finally, does she observe and provide that immediate feedback? So we're going to look at a video of this teacher doing this. I want to acknowledge that this video came from a research project by Barbara Foreman and colleagues at the Florida Center for Reading Research. These videos are available through her project, and the link to that is at the bottom of the screen, as is information about that project. And we're very grateful to Dr. Foreman and her team for providing us access so that we can include them in these for you. So let's take a look at that teacher example.
Your first word is T. Say T.
T.
Hold up one finger for each sound you hear in T.
E.
Touch your chips and move them as you say each sound you hear in T.
E.
Touch each chip and say the sounds in the word.
E.
Use your finger to track and read the word.
Sorry about that.
T.
Good job. All right. The next word, go ahead and clear your chips. The next word we're going to do is sun. Say sun.
Sun.
Say each sound in sun and hold up one finger for each sound you hear.
On.
And you move a chip for each sound that you hear in sun. I'm going to touch each chip and say the sound you hear in the word sun.
On.
Use your finger to track and read the word sun.
All All right, so let's talk about that video now and whether or not this met our criteria. So first, did she lead students in steps toward the learning outcome? She did. That's exactly what she does. That's a good meeting the criterion. Then, did she provide appropriate prompts? She provides very brief verbal prompts for the students. And she sometimes, as you can see in the picture here, she points at the mat or makes other gestures to support the students with prompting. And then in terms of observing and providing immediate feedback, she's observing. She doesn't actually provide immediate feedback to the students that's specific, but she's clearly observing. Since she's not seeing any mistakes, maybe it's adequate for her to say good job. I might suggest that she occasionally compliments students for specifically what it is that they're doing. So now we've had a chance to look at the guided, both the modeling and the practice. And I want to give you an opportunity now to see if you can put all these pieces together based on what we've talked about so far. So some of you may recommend this picture. This picture is sort of distorted. It's not exactly a good picture of Dr. Archer, but this picture, this is Dr. Archer. She's a faculty member. She's not a faculty member. She wrote a very influential book called Explicit Instruction with Charles Hughes. She has a website, explicitinstruction.org, some of you may know, and we highly recommend that book to you. And we're also grateful to Dr. Archer for allowing us to use her videos as part of this webinar and part of the course. We show examples from her videos several times in the course. So in this example, there's a very short lesson using explicit instruction. What you'll see here is that she's going to have the students use a response format. She hasn't taught them before. So she's an expert on explicit instruction, does demonstration lessons in schools. This is an example of her explaining to a classroom for the first time, students are not hers, how she wants them to respond to her. And she'll say that at the beginning. So that's her objective. What I'd like you to do is to look at how well she's using our cycle of explicit instruction. Is she using clear explanation modeling? And then is she using practice that's appropriate to student needs? And the other question would be if she's using supporting practices. We're not going to focus on that now. I'll say more about that after we watch Dr. Archer. So here is the classroom example with Dr. Archer.
You're ready? You're ready? You're ready? Hang out one more time. And 1, 2, 3, ready? You're perfect. You're perfect. Excellent. Now, here's something I do that may be a little bit different than your teacher, and that is when I ask a question, students in my class don't raise their hands. So when I ask a question, are you going to raise your hands? Yes or no, everyone? No. Unless I say raise your hand. So everybody raise your hand. Then you can do that. But here's what we're going to do instead. When the answers are very short, we're going to say the answers together. I'll ask a question. I will put up my hands. This says think, do not blurt. And when I lower my hands right there, you'll say the answer. Got it? Okay, ooh, good job sitting up. So get ready. So everybody, what day of the week is it? Everyone, it's?
November.
The day of the week is Friday. Oh, I can't believe you'd forget that. Let's try it again. So what day of the week is it? Think?
Friday.
Think? Everyone. Friday. Now let's practice that again. This is think. You don't say it until I lower my hands right there, okay? So what day of the week is it, everybody? It's?
Friday.
All right. Of course, tomorrow it will be?
Saturday.
I didn't fool you. After Saturday?
Sunday.
Perfect. That gives everybody a chance to think. You are so good.
Okay, so that's a great example of our explicit instruction framework. And let me talk through this in terms of our criteria. So in terms of clear explanation, did she give a clear explanation of what she expected students to do? Yes, it matched the learning outcome because she wanted them to respond when she held out her hands, and she explained that specifically. It was correct, it was clear, and it was concise. It didn't take her a long time to say it. And she used that same explanation consistently. Did she model multiple examples? Yes, she provided examples to the students. At first, they didn't quite get it. I'll say more about that. But then she provided examples so they would understand how to do it. She told them what she wanted them to do, and she had students observe her doing that. Then looking at practice, you can see there that after she explained it, she moved immediately to independent practice and asked the students to do it, which is where she got the response in November. Less important than that was that the students didn't all respond at the same time because they hadn't fully understood what to do. So you saw then Dr. Archer return to guided practice, and she reminded the students of the procedure and then had them do the step that constituted the procedure. So she gave a reminder, she gave a prompt, and then she had the students do it, and she gave immediate feedback both throughout, and you could see right there at the end of the lesson, she did a great job of summarizing what the purpose of this was and why it was helpful for students to do that. So it's a great example of how modeling and practice fit together. Underlying all of this, as I said, are supporting practices. There are 3 supporting practices that we're going to talk briefly about. One is to use different methods to elicit frequent responses. The second is to provide immediate specific feedback. And the third is to maintain a brisk pace. And the purpose of these is to promote engagement, okay? So this is the worst joke. I need to get rid of these slides. It's terrible. But just bear with me for a second. So there you see in the middle is a ring, engagement ring. Okay. The other thing we often think of with engagement is students doing fun stuff like bells and whistles. I'm sorry again, this is a terrible joke. But bells was kind of fun things that you might do. Students are more engaged when they're doing something kinesthetic, people think, and so on. And so having kind of fun gets mistaken for engagement. Of course, having fun is really great in school, but that's not the same thing as engagement. So engagement is not a ring. Engagement isn't bells and whistles. Engagement isn't just having fun in school. What we might mean by engagement is engagement when students' cognitive effort is focused on processing the lesson content. In other words, as you're teaching something, as students are learning something, everything they're thinking of is focused directly on what it is you want them to understand. And there are a variety of ways to do that. And the supporting practices are techniques that maximize student engagement, ways to support students that we know from extensive evidence are helpful for students to best learn the content. I haven't put into this presentation examples of the supporting practices because I didn't think we would have time, although I think we do. But I'll close with just wrapping up the important concepts about explicit instruction. First, that it's a research-based strategy, as Sarah said. Second, that it links to the idea that students need to reduce the cognitive load, especially students who need intensive intervention. And then finally, we designed, based on theory and earlier research, a simple model for you to think of how to provide explicit instruction, as well as a set of checklists to help you understand exactly what it might look like to do each of these things. So that is a wrap up of sort of an introduction to our course on explicit instruction. What I just showed to you occurs over 4 parts of one module. That's module 5. And then module 6 and 7, we talk about the supporting practices, and module 8 puts all of the components together. So that is what the course is about. I want to strongly encourage you to try it out. As I already said at the beginning, the best way to do it is to download the workbook, print it out for yourself, and start watching the videos in order and sort of doing it as you would as a student. And that'll give you the opportunity to see whether or not it's a good fit for your class, if you're a university faculty member, or an opportunity to see if it might work for a professional learning community you're part of, or whether if you're an instructional coach or something like that in a school or district, whether or not this might help you as well. So that is explicit instruction, and I'll turn it back over to Sarah and Rebecca.
Thank you, Devin. This is Rebecca Zumeta Edmonds again, and I am going to use this time to field any questions that folks may have. So I'm going, if you have questions for Devin or Sarah or myself, please put them into the chat, and we will be happy to respond to those. And so far, we have not received any questions from the field aside from, there is one question about the length of each module. So Devin, do you think you could speak to that?
Yeah, so the module, so each module has a set of parts to it. Each module has 3 or 4 parts. The first module has 4 parts to it, and each of the parts is about 3 hours. Some of them are shorter than that, and the idea was that we would provide enough content that this is something you could do over the course of a semester. You don't have to do all the parts, but we provided a lot of detail in them. And so the videos basically are the bulk of the time spent in here. And so that's based on the length of the videos.
Great. And I'll, to make sure that folks understand as well, part of the purpose of these courses, these modules, and the sort of overall courses that are being developed is so that they could be used as part of a graduate course or undergraduate course for pre-service teachers or people who are taking part in a multi-series set of professional development or doing continuing education or something of that nature. So they're not intended to be something that you would sit down and get all of the information in an hour or two, but really to be kind of worked through over time, either with an instructor or, potentially independently, but more often it would be done with some kind of a professor or professional development provider, and so that all that content is there for the person who's planning to deliver the course. Other questions? I'll just give folks another minute or so to put anything into the chat.
It was either so clear that they had no questions, or this is what you call stunned silence. I'm hoping it's the first one, but who knows?
Hi, Rebecca. This is Amy. I put a couple into the chat for you. One question was around the specific research for use with math interventions. And Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to just touch base on a little bit and preview the math course as well.
Yeah, so all of the content that Devin talked about in terms of explicit instruction is applicable to mathematics, and I appreciate that he had a mathematics example there. And as part of the courses that have been developed with the National Center on Intensive Intervention, I think the next one to be released is going to be a course specifically focused on math. And pretty similar to the explicit instruction course, that has, what did you say, Devin, 4 different parts to it?
Yep.
Yeah, so that'll have 4 different parts. The math course actually has 8 different parts, and so a lot of the focus is on explicit instruction, but we also dig into assessment within a DBI framework, so focusing on progress monitoring and math diagnostics. We do some deep dives into content that should be included in math intervention, both whole number content and rational number content. And then we also talk about fidelity of implementation and then adaptations to instruction when the initial intervention platform is not as beneficial for students as we would like it to be. So I'm finishing up the finishing touches on that, and so we hope that it will be released on the National Center website in just the next few months.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I've seen another question come in just asking about was someone interested in what the learning theory, the notion of explicit instruction is based on.
Yeah, that's a great question. So explicit instruction, I would say, comes out of both a social cognitive perspective on learning and a behavioral way of thinking about learning. But I want to emphasize here that it's really part of a continuum. So here we focus on explicit instruction, and we focused on the idea that in a social cognitive theory of learning, if you think about Bandura and Zimmerman are examples of people in that area, that they think about sort of goal orientations and reaching those goals. And so in a structure like that, and a way of thinking about learning that way, this gives us a reason to focus very specifically on different kinds of tasks in order to give students tools to basically master concepts related to those tasks, right? I would also say it's behavioral in the sense that when you think about behavioral ways of thinking about learning, we think about providing a stimulus and then a response to that, or we have an antecedent and then a behavior. And this is all about creating an environment in which we have a very structured set of antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, by which I mean we have a set of procedures that we specifically follow, and so it fits into that as well. I want to emphasize as well that explicit instruction is as I already said, only part of what makes for successful instruction. I want to recommend again to you the Martin article, and the reason is that Martin talks about the value of explicit instruction as a way of reducing cognitive load when you learn something for the first time. Particularly for students who need intensive intervention, sometimes it can take a while for them to build those foundational understandings to reduce the working memory load adequately. But once we've reduced the working memory load adequately, we've established foundational concepts, it's absolutely appropriate then to move into a different form of instruction. For example, guided discovery learning actually has a track record of providing student success in the event that, one, students have the foundational knowledge, and two, the teacher provides clear guidance. Just creating a discovery environment does not have good evidence. But I want to emphasize that the idea here is not always to do explicit instruction, but that to use explicit instruction as a tool to provide that foundational understanding on which students can then build a greater and broader understanding. They can learn to use things in flexible, different ways. But explicit instruction provides that foundational framework.
Thank you, Devin. There was one other question that came in reference to the videos from Florida, the Florida Center for Reading Research. Are those also available in Module 5?
There are several of those videos in Module 5. There are actually, the most of those videos occur in Module 8. Module 8 is a module where we put everything together. We take all the checklists and we work through them in parts. And so the videos are there. If you download the workbooks, the links to each of the videos is underneath the video itself. So you can look on there and you can get the link directly from that. And they have a YouTube channel that you can go to. I can't think of the name of it at the moment, but they're all available if you look at the citation on the PowerPoint.
Great. One more question that came in is, how much importance do you put on teachers explaining steps and definitions before modeling, as opposed to modeling and expecting students to guess the important things the teacher is doing?
Well, I can go back to one of the items on the checklist, and we look at the modeling component. The third criterion is to have students observe during the model. So when you're modeling or explaining something new, it is essential that students are simply observing and are not being asked to do the work. Because if you have the students do the work during a model, they may not be confident in their understanding of it. We're increasing the working memory load on them, and the result is that students won't get the concepts. An example of this is, one thing I see teachers say sometimes is they'll introduce a new vocabulary word. A student teacher I saw once say, what is, so it was a lesson on congruence, and the teacher started the lesson by saying, what do you think congruence means? And the students had no idea. There was no response from the classroom. Another example might be, teacher starts with a KWL chart and asks students, what do you know about the Roman Empire? And crickets, because the students don't know anything about the Roman Empire. So the goal in explicit instruction is to provide the information at the beginning. It is, in fact, about telling students things at the outset, which in some places is, controversial. I've heard teachers say to me, like, when we've done this kind of work, that they might need to get permission actually to do some of this explicit instruction. But the data are incredibly clear that this is an effective practice. It's effective for students in general, and it's definitely effective for students who need intensive intervention. So in response to the question, the person asked, do we have the students figure it out for themselves? Absolutely not. We're going to have students observe instead of providing we're going to have them observe, and then they're going to do it. And you saw in Ms. Leonard's video, the first example, she showed them what to do. She didn't make the students do any of the work.
Great, thank you. Sarah, Dr. Powell, this is a question for you. How do you see explicit instruction within a project-based learning environment?
Okay, so this is a good question, and Devin's kind of touched upon a little bit of this. in terms of some of his answers to the explicit instruction questions. So the thing that is necessary for students if they are participating in a project-based classroom or learning environment or something that's a little bit more inquiry-based, which we often see in mathematics classrooms, is that students need to have a set of foundational skills in mathematics in order to participate successfully in that environment. And Devin just talked a little bit about this with his last response. And so when we think of like, you know, these are the activities or these are the projects that we want students to participate in, if students don't have, you know, an underlying threshold where they can actively participate, we need to provide explicit instruction on those foundational math skills in order to help students be successful in that type of classroom environment. And so as Devin said, really explicit instruction is not the only method of instruction that we are talking about, but it's for those students that have experienced difficulty in reading or mathematics or writing or science. And what we are doing is trying to help those students understand the basics and the fundamentals of those skills so that they can go on and participate in general education classroom environments successful. So there is a role for explicit instruction within classrooms that are focused on project-based learning, as there is a role for project-based learning in the, you know, in the educational programs for most students in schools in the U.S.
Great, thank you, Sarah. At this point, I don't see any other questions. Why don't we give about 1 more minute for anyone to enter anything else into the chat box?
I just wanted to make one clarification. This is Amy. On the main landing page, if you're there with the main landing page with the text and the 4 boxes of the different modules, to get to the specific pages for each individual module, you'll click on the link within that box for that module. So you'll see the module title up there, click on that link, and you'll see that page where Devin had some screenshots up on the webinar that included, you know, the picture of him in the video and the related resources and all of that. Each of those individual modules have multiple parts within them and a lot of different components underneath them. So go to the individual module pages to get the bulk of the content, including the workbook and the PowerPoint slides for each individual module and all of that. So the main landing page includes those 4 modules in the courses, in the whole course, and then each module page has all of the components underneath that.
Great, thank you, Amy. At this point, I don't see any other questions coming in, so we will go ahead and wrap up. And I'd like to thank our presenters today, Dr. Devin Kearns and Dr. Sarah Powell. We really appreciate your time and attention to this topic and all the work that you've done to create these great online courses. Again, today's focus was on the first course on explicit instruction, but we do have another one coming very soon that will focus specifically on mathematics. And so we look forward to sharing that with you as well. Please, if you do have other questions that come up after today's webinar, please don't hesitate to email either Dr. Kearns and Dr. Powell at their addresses that are included on the slides at the end, or directly to ncii@air.org. And we will be happy to work on getting answers to your questions.
And this is Amy one more time, and I just wanted to highlight that we will be posting the recording for this webinar as well as the slides from today's webinar up on the NCII website as soon as we possibly can. It might take us about a day to get the download and clean up the recording, but we should have that up and available for you if you want to share it with other people or access the slides or any of that. So that will be up there. Just go ahead, and if you can't find it, we'll put it on the homepage in that carousel. But if you have any problems with tracking it down, use the search and look for explicit. If you type that in, you'll get all of the explicit instruction course content, as well as this webinar and anything else that comes out on this series.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. Thanks to everyone, and have a good rest of your afternoon or evening, depending on what time zone you're joining us from. Take care.
Thank you.